Located approximately 400 kilometers west of the Russian mainland, around 1,300 kilometers from Moscow, Kaliningrad is bordered to the north and south by Lithuania and Poland. Essentially, it's a Russian outpost, but one that's had a growing strategic significance due to its close proximity to a large number of major European cities. Kaliningrad also has the only port on the Baltic Sea that remains ice-free all year, making it the ideal home for the Russian Navy's Baltic Fleet. Originally founded in the 13th century, this historic oblast is home to nearly 500,000 people, but also serves as a key strategical element in Russia's anti-NATO strategy. Recently, however, as Putin struggles to maintain Russia's status as a global superpower, Kaliningrad has become as much of a headache for him as it's been an asset and could become a serious liability to his campaign of aggressive expansion in Ukraine and beyond. For one, Russia's military forces remain overextended as the war in Ukraine drags on, leaving Kaliningrad largely out from under Putin's thumb, which may be why we're hearing a clear call for dissension rising up among its separatist groups. Emboldened by the hardships of the war, the leaders of the Baltic Republican Party have been calling not only for independence from Russia, but also for Kaliningrad to align with the West and its allies against the Russian president. Since the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, Moscow has enhanced both aerial and naval connections between the Russian mainland and Kaliningrad. Given Russia's current struggles in Ukraine, however, it seems unlikely that it will achieve its overall objective and isolate the Baltics. And as political pressures within Russia intensify and external pressures build due to the fallout of the war in Ukraine, the possibility of Russia losing Kaliningrad altogether has grown increasingly likely. If this happens, it will undoubtedly alter not only Russia's future, but also the futures of Europe, America, and various other parts of the world. So what's happening? How is Russia losing control of Kaliningrad? And perhaps a more important question, what consequences will there be if it does? In this video, we're going to take a look at these questions, while also closely examining the events that led up to this pivotal moment in Kaliningrad's long history. To really understand what the impact of losing Kaliningrad would be, we must first understand the influence it's had on Russia's recent history. Rewinding back to the first months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin found himself in desperate need of the Kaliningrad exclave. Rather quickly, what Putin thought would be a swift blitzkrieg all the way to Kyiv instead turned out to be something else entirely, as many of Russia's frontline troops ended up in hasty retreat from key regions such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy. This grievous miscalculation left Russia wide open to the possibility of a devastating counteroffensive. So Putin turned to one of the most powerful weapons in his arsenal, the threat of nuclear retaliation. And what has helped make this weapon an even more credible deterrent? That's right, Kaliningrad. To get the ball rolling as early as May 2022, as much of the Russian army fell into retreat, Putin initiated a series of provocative military exercises in Kaliningrad, with the intention of demonstrating that he could, hypothetically, launch nuclear warheads all across Europe. During the exercises, Russian troops practiced electronic launches of nuclear-capable Iskander mobile ballistic systems, the same systems being used against Ukraine. And for what ultimate purpose? Essentially, Putin wanted to make the point that as long as he controlled Kaliningrad, no NATO member state would be beyond his reach. What's interesting about these maneuvers, though, is that the primary goal of them may not have been to remind the West that Russia has nukes, but rather to remind them that Russia has Kaliningrad. It's hard to forget that Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, but it's much easier to forget, or at least to underestimate, the strategic importance of this relatively unassuming Baltic Sea exclave. This, however, would be a mistake. And for one very good reason, the Suwalki Gap, which is, according to many military analysts, by far NATO's weakest point. But more on that later. For now, it's important to note that Kaliningrad was not always a part of Russia. It was founded in 1255 by the Teutonic Knights under the name Königsberg on the site of the ancient Old Prussian settlement of Twangstay. From then up until World War II, Königsberg would serve as Germany's easternmost major city. But after Germany's surrender in July and August of 1945, as part of the Potsdam Conference, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee, and US President Harry Truman effectively redrew Europe's borders, and in the end, Königsberg was handed over to the Soviet Union and renamed Kaliningrad in honor of Bolshevik revolutionary Mikhail Kalinin. Unsurprisingly, the region experienced a notable demographic shift as the German population was expelled and the Soviet citizens came flooding in. But as Europe has continued to evolve over the past 79 years, the Russian oblast has become increasingly isolated, and this isolation has only been exacerbated since the invasion of Ukraine. As neighboring countries close their borders, NATO expands its membership, and the Kremlin remains focused on waging war. So far, some 5,000 Kaliningrad residents have been mobilized to fight in Ukraine, with an estimated 450 being killed in action already. The authorities in Kaliningrad, however, rarely discuss casualties, focusing instead on its contributions to the war effort, which has included quadcopters, camouflage nets, and clothes. A significant portion of its 2024 budget will also be allocated to help finance the war. And in return, Moscow has been pouring money into Kaliningrad to help mitigate the impact of Western sanctions and bolster the exclave's vast military infrastructure. Moscow has also shown great interest in preparing Kaliningrad to operate independently, mostly via infrastructure projects that would reduce its dependence on neighboring countries just in case it becomes cut off from the Russian mainland. And bolstering Kaliningrad's autonomy is probably a good idea, given NATO's continued expansion that includes the accession of Finland and Sweden into the alliance. At this moment, as the NATO net surrounding Kaliningrad gets increasingly tighter, the Baltic Sea is beginning to look more like the NATO Sea. But what this really means for the isolated exclave is that it doesn't need any more problems with its neighbors. Wedged in between the NATO and EU member states of Poland and Lithuania, Kaliningrad relies heavily on its neighbors for food, but also remains dependent on mainland Russia for a number of other necessary goods. And every year, millions of tons of Russian oil, coal, and coke, a carbonaceous material used in the production of steel, are transported by rail through Lithuania. Over the past several years, however, the relationship between Lithuania and Russia has gotten increasingly rocky. For one thing, right around the time of Russia's massive Zapad 2017 military exercise, Lithuania built a new border fence. And for two, Lithuanian helicopters have been known to hover over the railway when Russian military trains are passing through, possibly conducting surveillance. Following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, though, things have gone from bad to worse. Due to EU sanctions, nearly half of all the goods that would normally pass through Lithuania, in or out of Kaliningrad, including coal, metal, construction materials, and various modern technologies, are now banned from entering any EU territory. And even before these rail sanctions, there was the implementation of the EU's flight ban, which forced Lithuania to close its airspace to flights from Russia to Kaliningrad, forcing commercial carriers to use a longer route that took them out over the Baltic Sea. Unfortunately, the people most affected by these sanctions are the people of Kaliningrad. In response, Kaliningrad's governor, Anton Alikhanov, assured worried citizens that regular ferry services from St. Petersburg would help soften the blow. For their part, Russia's foreign ministry has accused Lithuania of violating international agreements that facilitate transit from mainland Russia, while the Kremlin denounced Lithuania's actions as a blockade against its citizens and threatened ambiguous consequences. In its defense, the Lithuanian foreign ministry said it was simply complying with EU sanctions and clarified that the transit of passengers and non-sanctioned goods to and from Kaliningrad through Lithuania would continue uninterrupted. But just to be on the safe side, Lithuania also ramped up its railway security measures and established a permanent helicopter presence over certain sections of track. However ruffled Putin's feathers might be, though, he better be careful not to bite off more than he can chew. Lithuania has been a member of NATO for 2 decades, which means that any direct military action from Russia will invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, obligating the entire alliance to come to its defense. During his 2022 State of the Union address, US President Joe Biden even pledged to defend all NATO territory, then expanded the US's troop presence in Lithuania by around 1,000 soldiers. Which brings us back to the Suwalki Gap. Stretching around 100 kilometers along the Lithuanian-Polish border, the gap separates Kaliningrad from the pro-Russian state of Belarus. So why is this a major concern for the West? Well, a fortified Russian presence along the gap would isolate Lithuania and Latvia from Poland and the rest of the EU. This is why a number of Western militaries believe that if war in Ukraine escalates into a full-on hot war with NATO, this corridor will be one of Russia's first targets. Because in the event of a conflict with Russia, the location of the Suwalki Gap would make it nearly impossible for NATO forces to reinforce the Baltic states. Russia could easily add heavy fortifications to this narrow strip of land, making it a potential death trap for NATO troops. Various wargame simulations have predicted catastrophic casualties if NATO forces attempt to pass through it, Putin's perceived willingness to sacrifice the lives of his troops would also give him a strategic advantage in using the Suwalki Gap to isolate the Baltic states and maintain his foothold in Kaliningrad. Hypothetically, Russia could sweep into the corridor simultaneously from east and west, cutting off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from the rest of NATO. But this move would also lead to an immediate confrontation between Moscow and NATO's many nuclear-armed members, which, if not de-escalated very carefully, could lead to an unprecedented catastrophe. If Putin does ultimately move against, let's say, Poland or Lithuania, it would certainly trigger NATO's mutual defense provision. But what NATO's actual response would be still remains unclear. For now, the Baltic's vulnerability to Russian aggression is central among NATO's many concerns. Exacerbated by Russia's actions in Ukraine, this has led to a shift in NATO's approach to security. And as they consider stationing more troops in the region to deter a potential assault, even skeptics now recognize the need for forward defense in Eastern Europe. The Suwalki Corridor's significance has taken the stage again recently, after Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki raised concerns about the Wagner PMC, or the Wagner Group, a volatile Russian mercenary group who is reportedly operating in the area. Intelligence reports have indicated that over 100 Wagner mercenaries have been deployed near the Suwalki Gap, in close proximity to Grodno in Belarus. Morawiecki's primary concern is that these mercenaries might be posing as Belarusian border guards or migrants as they try to infiltrate Polish territory in an attempt to further destabilize the region. Given how important Poland's military is to the region's defense, Putin might just try to exploit the historical tensions that exist between Poland and Lithuania surrounding the Suwalki Gap, a similar tactic he used in Donbass. The Wagner Group lost some of its credibility after a recent mutiny among its fighters, yet this also proved that the group was ready to employ brutal tactics to advance its mysterious political and military objectives. Supported by some influential Russian elites, the Wagner Group has attracted the attention of both the West and the Kremlin, which ultimately made a deal with them to end the mutiny. As a result, a significant number of Wagner fighters were relocated to Belarus. What's also concerning are the rumors that the Wagner Group played a role in the recent military coup in Niger, which ousted the country's pro-Western democratically elected government. Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin applauded the coup, and the new military leadership in Niger were quick to welcome the support. So, could the Wagner PMC act as a similar destabilizing force in Eastern Europe? That's certainly one of NATO's concerns at the moment. Putin's motive for enlisting these unruly mercenaries is likely not related to territorial expansion, but to probe NATO's resolve, using a series of strategically orchestrated moves. What can they do when the instigators are non-state actors, such as the Wagner Group? It's this ambiguity that gives Russia a buffer of plausible deniability. To stay ahead of this fiasco, NATO needs to rely on improved surveillance measures, enhanced intelligence sharing, and a unified approach to responding to such conflicts. Despite all the hype surrounding the Suwalki Gap, however, there are some who believe its importance has been overblown, that its perceived strategic significance stems from a misconception regarding its military value and potential vulnerability. For some, it's unclear just why Russia would need to physically close the gap or seize territory in the Baltic states to cut off potential NATO reinforcements. In a major military confrontation between Russia and NATO forces, geographical boundaries wouldn't really matter. Plus, the Suwalki Gap lacks natural features that would present any unique military challenges or opportunities. And besides, any aggressive action in the region would create significant political challenges for Moscow and likely lead to the invocation of Article 5, which Putin does not want. The military threat associated with the Suwalki Gap is also not one-sided. NATO forces could easily get the drop on Russian assets in the region, including those in Kaliningrad. In its efforts to secure the gap, Russia would also likely face a range of logistical challenges, similar to those they ran into during the invasion of Ukraine. If the gap's strategic value is taken too seriously, some analysts have warned the US and its NATO allies might be prompted to deploy a significant military presence to the region, which might only create other problems. Massed troops might just end up being prime targets for Russian long-range strikes. Putin would likely also interpret such a strong military presence as a potential threat, one capable of launching an attack on Kaliningrad or Belarus and perhaps provoking an exaggerated response. Heavily militarizing this region could also provoke other NATO countries to take action, ones that might have been previously hesitant to confront Russia, leading to further escalation of this already complex situation. This does not suggest that the region between Poland and Lithuania, which is an internationally recognized border between two NATO and EU member states, lacks strategic importance. But it might be a better idea to focus on the more vulnerable areas of NATO's eastern flank instead, the towns and communities in the Baltic countries, especially Latvia and Estonia that are nearest to the Russian border. Dispersal of military elements rather than concentration would create more opportunities for engagement with NATO military forces and likely be a better deterrent of Russian aggression. Another and perhaps bigger issue we should be concerned about right now is Russia's long-range missile capabilities, which do not depend on the Suwalki Gap to be effective. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in fact, Kaliningrad became crucial for Russia's defense strategy, which has consisted primarily of demonstrating its nuclear capabilities in the hope of deterring NATO intervention. Even if Putin has, in the past, been liberally threatening nuclear war, it's likely been more to influence public opinion and not as a serious threat of military action. History suggests that nuclear threats are rarely acted upon. Even in past conflicts such as the Korean War, not to mention the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russia didn't use nuclear weapons, which is why most experienced world leaders, keeping in mind the low probability of actual nuclear retaliation, are unlikely to be swayed or provoked by mere nuclear saber-rattling. And perhaps Putin has been catching on to this notion as well, because as of late it's been Russia's more nationalist hardliners calling for nuclear action, while Putin has been content to sit back and present himself as a force for reason, although never actually taking the threat off the table. Some of Russia's hardliners have even argued that an atomic blast in Ukraine, in Europe, or maybe in a test over Siberia will be the only way to reignite the fear of Russian aggression in the West. Former chairman of Russia's Federation Council, Sergei Mironov, who is now the leader of the A Just Russia party, said recently that any attempt by the West to enter the Baltic region would be a real red line, or rather a red button, that Russia would be forced to press. Mironov seems to think that just because Russia is a nuclear power, that it would be justified in using its capability to defend its territory. And by its territory, he means every Russian region, regardless of whether the West recognize it as such or not. Mironov also went on to repeat the usual Kremlin rhetoric about invading Ukraine solely in retaliation to NATO actions and to rid the country of neo-Nazis. This scenario, however, has become somewhat typical in Moscow, with Russian hardliners spouting off about using or testing nuclear weapons, while Putin presents himself as the sole moderator, holding back the dogs of nuclear war. Rightfully suspicious of Putin's cool attitude, American and European officials have begun to speculate. Several factors, they believe, have contributed to the Russian president's somewhat more rational approach to nuclear weapons. For one, he may still be recovering from the backlash from China, India, and others who warned him there was no justification for using nuclear weapons. He might also be feeling more confident about his position in Ukraine. Either way, he still found the opportunity recently to casually mention that Moscow had successfully tested a terrifying new nuclear-powered cruise missile, one with a global range that's part of Russia's expanding arsenal of strategic nuclear weapons. Putin has also warned that if Finland and Sweden join NATO, Russia would have no choice but to strengthen its defenses in the Baltic region, which would include the deployment of nuclear weapons. Lithuanian Defense Minister Arvydas Anušauskas, however, has long insisted that Russia has had nuclear weapons stored in Kaliningrad for some time. His claims have not been independently verified, but other reports have indicated that in recent years, Russia's nuclear weapons storage bunkers in Kaliningrad have been upgraded. Both Finland and Sweden have been official partners of NATO since 1994 and have made significant contributions to the alliance's missions. But on April 4, 2023, after Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan withdrew a series of objections, Finland became the newest NATO member, increasing the number of member states to 31, and paving the way for Sweden's application and impending acceptance into the Western Defence Alliance. The decision made by both of these Nordic nations to join NATO marks a significant shift from their historically neutral positions. But there's no secrets surrounding what ultimately inspired them. The invasion of Ukraine shattered the long-standing sense of stability in Northern Europe, which left both Sweden and Finland feeling increasingly vulnerable to potential threats. For many Finns, the war in Ukraine sparked haunting memories of the 1939 Soviet invasion, which resulted in the loss of significant territory and raised serious concerns about the security of Finland's border with Russia. Over the past decade, Sweden has also had to reassess its potential vulnerability. In 2013, Russian bomber planes simulated an attack on Stockholm. Then in 2014, there were reports of a Russian submarine lurking in Swedish waters. Then in 2018, there was the countrywide distribution of army pamphlets titled "If Crisis or War Comes," which hinted to the growing concerns regarding national security within the Swedish government. While both nations have been rightfully worried about potential repercussions from Russia, it became clear that NATO membership was a necessary step to ensure their security in a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape. Joining NATO will provide them with the same security guarantees under Article 5 as any other member. With Finland and Sweden deciding to join up, it seems that more and more of Putin's red lines keep getting crossed without retaliation. And as Western nations continue sending tanks and missile systems to Ukraine, not to mention training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s, President Biden and his NATO friends have seemingly begun to relax. To be clear, no one is saying that Putin absolutely won't resort to using nuclear weapons against Ukraine or its allies, especially if he starts to lose territory in Crimea, but as the war drags on, it seems less likely he will voluntarily kick off the apocalypse. Which is why, no matter how disastrous the war in Ukraine ends up, examining certain more realistic outcomes is helpful too. One issue of great future importance that has been widely debated among Western analysts is Russia's future ability to restore its military strength. For this matters, especially when we're looking at the future of the Baltic region, which will undoubtedly remain a crucial strategic junction for both Russia and NATO. For now, it seems that the substantial investment Moscow has made to modernize its military has been largely squandered, and that Russia's weakened economy likely won't be able to sustain any similar investment for many years. Whenever this war ends, it will also be imperative to restore the global framework for strategic, non-strategic nuclear arms control, to re-establish these agreements and standards that have been seriously eroded by the escalation of Russian nuclear rhetoric and blackmail will be especially vital for Moscow if it wants to be welcomed back to the international bargaining table. Certain members of Moscow's expert community, mainly risk-averse political elites and some senior military officials, have more and more begun to push back against reckless nuclear saber-rattling, recognizing the utter impracticality of nuclear warfare, especially given the state of Russia's armed forces. But still, Putin has adamantly rejected any proposal to reduce Russia's nuclear arsenal. So as it looks now, whoever comes after Putin will have the challenge of shifting the government away from a nuclear-centric, even nuclear-worshipping mindset. Putin's successor will also have to face the strategic reality that if the war in Ukraine is still going, they will need to de-escalate tensions in the Nordic-Baltic region to avoid a potentially unwinnable arms race with NATO. But for now, Putin is still in charge, and he seems perfectly content to rely on veiled nuclear threats to hopefully deter the West and possibly distract them from Kaliningrad's potential strategic importance. And this may work for a time, but time is what Putin seems to be running out of, as groups of increasingly vocal separatists continue to threaten Russia's hold on the Kaliningrad exclave. Ever since Kaliningrad became a Russian exclave, there have been whispers among native intellectuals about the possibility of one day achieving independence. For many years, there weren't any grassroots sectionist movements, but there was enough talk to spark fears of separatism in Moscow, fears that were largely fueled by objective factors like Kaliningrad's far-out geographical position, which makes it all that much more susceptible to foreign influence. After the Soviet Union collapsed, and on through the 1990s, there were repeated public calls for Kaliningrad to become the Fourth Baltic Republic. But because of the oblast's importance as home to Russia's Baltic fleet, which could no longer use ports in the Baltic countries, Moscow cracked down hard on that sentiment. But in the 21st century, as economic conditions have worsened, and the contrast between life in the exclave and life in Lithuania or Poland has increased, separatist sentiments are once again on the rise. As a result of this, the influence of Russia's state media also appears to be waning in the region, despite Moscow's efforts to combat what it's called a growing enthusiasm for Germanization and creeping separatism. These efforts have included expelling German-backed NGOs, launching campaigns against the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and dismissing academics with ties to cultural organizations in Germany. And as information remains scarce due to Kremlin censorship, assessing the true extent of support for independence proves challenging, with many residents remaining cautious about openly advocating for secession. Perhaps the loudest voice at the moment, though, is that of the Baltic Republican Party, or BRP, which was founded in 1993 by Königsberg natives, also known as Baltic Russians. In an uncommon display of protest, just before the invasion of Ukraine, protests erupted outside the Russian embassy in Warsaw, as members of the BRP demanded demilitarization of the exclave. A year later, an unauthorized and potentially illegal online referendum took place in 5 Russian regions. Some 95,567 people participated, about 19.4% of the population, and all the regions that were polled voted in favor of independence. Much of the information we have comes from reporting outside Russia or reports made prior to the war in Ukraine, so it's possible that results simply reflect the bias towards pro-independence sentiment among the participants. But if anything, the referendum still served as a potential reminder that there are still those eager for independence. Perhaps encouraged by the vote, despite the Kremlin's efforts to stifle separatist movements through censorship and media restrictions, the BRP believes secession from Russia is only a matter of time. To make their point, when referring to the exclave, the party uses the name Königsberg, the German name for the city before it was handed over to the Soviet Union after World War II, claiming that it rightfully belongs to Europe. Party membership, they also say, has been steadily increasing both within Königsberg and the region surrounding it. One day, one way or another, the war in Ukraine will come to an end. And when it does, the structure of the Russian Federation will almost certainly change. If Russia prevails, well, life in Kaliningrad will likely not improve, but there are also many other scenarios that could lead to greater autonomy and even full independence for the former German city. With that said, the Kremlin has no intention of losing any part of its empire and will therefore continue to crack down on separatism. Even with the support from its European neighbors, unless drastic post-war changes occur within Russian society, Kaliningrad's sovereignty may remain out of reach for some time to come. In the meantime, the desire to revitalize East Prussian culture and the goal of an independent Königsberg will persist, likely until the right time and conditions for making the first steps in this direction are met. Unfortunately, the future of the Kaliningrad exclave will largely depend on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And when it ends, the stage will either be set for freedom or the dream may die forever. It couldn't hurt to ask, with all the changes happening in the Baltic region lately, what are the chances Russia simply loses interest in Kaliningrad? Some might even say that when Finland and Sweden officially joined NATO, aligning themselves with Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, Kaliningrad shifted from a strategic asset for Russia to more of a burdensome liability. In a very short time, Russia's chances of creating a chokehold for NATO at the Suwalki Gap went from good to nearly impossible. And on top of that, NATO now has the ability to bypass the gap entirely, deploying troops from the north, across the sea, or via air routes, keeping their distance from Kaliningrad's missile batteries and anti-air defense systems. These developments have fundamentally transformed the strategic significance of Kaliningrad, so much so that the French Institute of International Relations recently declared that the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO has largely upended Russian strategic planning and that its goal to exploit military superiority has been lost. The report also pointed out that during the first phase of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia redeployed its most combat-capable units, including its Air Assault Division and Marine Brigade, to support its offensive operations there, while at the same time, all amphibious capabilities of the Baltic Fleet were dispatched to the Black Sea. Now these units are fully engaged in countering the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has left Fortress Kaliningrad largely undefended. To Russia's credit, they have maintained unrestricted access to Belarus, but its current shortage of forces limits the benefit of this alliance. Lately, Russian and Belarusian forces have come together for a number of military exercises, including the Zapad 2021 exercises, but it's mostly been Russia's aerospace forces that are using Belarusian airbases for attack missions in Ukraine. Russian ground troops have, too, been consuming large amounts of ammunition from Belarus's pre-war arsenal. It's Putin's deployment of non-strategic nuclear warheads to Belarus, though, that could create the most trouble down the road. Complicating things for Belarus even further was the arrival of several thousand Wagner mercenaries after the failed mutiny in June 2023. Lacking any real sense of organization or heavy weapons, these guns for hire simply weren't capable of turning the tide in Ukraine or posing any real threat to Belarus's NATO member neighbors. But they did, as mentioned earlier, stir things up around the Suwalki Gap. But even though they make them a bit nervous, Poland is fully capable of addressing the Wagner threat. What's less clear is why Putin thought it would be a good strategy to relocate this unstable group of mercenaries just 25 kilometers from his base in Asivapichi, the supposed location of Russia's nuclear warheads. With everything that's happened, regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, Russia has little chance of re-establishing its previous military authority in the Baltic theater, or even matching its regional forces with NATO's. Putin will probably continue to lean on trusted deterrent strategies like nuclear saber-rattling and so on, hoping that the West will take into consideration all the urban targets that are within reach of his Kalibr and Iskander missiles. Or he may just go all the way and openly deploy nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad. But in the end, these will only be half measures, and won't do much to shift the reality of Russia's crumbling strategic position. Perhaps the best future we can hope for right now is a post-Putin leadership that's less inclined to seek out militarized confrontation with the West, and instead look for opportunities to restore cooperation and stability to the Baltic region. But what do you think? Is Kaliningrad the key to dominating the Baltic region? What will happen if Russia manages to close the Suwalki Gap? Are all Putin's nuclear threats just noise, or is he actually capable of pressing the button? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.